Hi everyone. Okay, we have a bit of a lull in between tournaments at the moment. In a couple of weeks we'll have big activity in the chess world with the candidates tournament. So rather than returning immediately to Nimzovich, I thought I would show you one of my own games from this season. I'm now playing for my club Cavan in the Ennis division of the Irish system. We were playing Elm Mount a few weeks ago and I was on board one with the black pieces. My opponent was a Filipino man called Ramon Saclolo. He opened with e4. We'll just flip this around so we can see it from my perspective. And at this moment, would you believe it, I actually spent about 5 minutes choosing which opening to play. I read an interesting anecdote subsequently about David Bronstein once spending 40 minutes on his first move. I'd been playing the French and the Sicilian all season and had a loss with the Neudorf, and online I've been playing the modern defense with g6 now, and I'd also been giving consideration to going back to the Caro-Kann after several years of not playing it. However, I learnt the hard way that electing for openings with which you're not overly familiar can be a big mistake in over the board games, so in the end I settled on the French. And so we went into the main lines with d4, d5, and now my opponent played knight c3, which I was glad to see. Personally, the Tarrasch with knight d2 I find to be the most difficult to play against. So you have to be very careful against the Tarrasch. I played the line with knight f6 after knight d2. Knight f6 here, as opposed to an immediate c5, because I prefer to close games, which is what this leads to. c5 is the other option for black here, the other main option. So anyway, my opponent played knight c3 and I went for the Winnower, which is one of my favourite to play. I had a game in a simultaneous exhibition against Nigel Short a couple of years ago, in which I'd done extensive preparation in the poison pawn variation. He managed to avoid it with an obscure sideline and beat me in about 40 moves, but I've always hoped I would get to use it at some point. So far I've only done so online in short games, so it would be nice to use it sometime. And in this position black has the illusory threat of bishop takes c3 and then d takes e4, but it doesn't win a pawn, because white can answer with queen g4, which is going to fork the pawn on e4 and the pawn on g7, and in fact the board will be more open in those lines than when white plays e5, so which in theory is going to be better for the bishop pair. So regardless of that, my opponent continued with the main line e5, and I answered in suit with c5. Next game a3, just all normal stuff. Putting the question to the bishop, and I played bishop takes c3 check, consistent with my previous play and the general strategy of the Winnower. Black gives up the bishop pair to inflict double the pawns with the hope that his knights will outplay the white bishop pair in the closed structures. There are also lines with bishop a5. This is called the Armenian variation, but this is what I know best and what I've had the best results with, so that's what I went for. So b takes c3 and now knight e7, which is the main line. Black can also play queen c7 here, but this is, again, is the line that I like to play myself. And the main line for white here, well, there are several, but the one I was hoping for was queen g4, which is the main line poison pawn. I'll show you that in a moment. My opponent, however, played f4 to bolster his center, this pawn here on e5, and Bobby Fischer mentions this move in his famous book My 16 Memorable Games, and points out that though it's tempting, it restricts the activity of white's dark squared bishop, which is a significant factor. White is hoping to play on the king side here. This makes sense given the pawn structure, and aim for a later f5 break in order to attack, but this move f4 is questionable to some degree. As I said, it restricts his bishop, which in theory should be a powerful piece given that I've traded off my dark square bishop. It's important to note too that d takes c5 doesn't win a pawn. After queen a5, forks c3, and c5. White can defend both of them with queen d4, but now simply knight c6, and the c5 pawn will fall on the next move. If queen e3, then d4 gives white some problems. The poison pawn main line is with queen g4. And after queen c7 comes queen takes g7, rook g8, queen takes h7, c takes d4, and white is a pawn up, but black has good initiative now and wrecks the white center. There's no c takes d4 here because of queen a3 check, picking up the rook on a1. And this leads to very sharp games. Black gets strong central play, but white does as well on the king side, and his passed h pawn here on h2 at the moment can become a serious factor. I've actually done a whole series on this line. If you go to the playlists, it's there. So we'll go back to the game anyway. My opponent played f4, and I answered with queen a5. The three-time world champion Mikhail Botvinnik is one of the greatest winnower players of all time, and he often used this move in the early stage of the opening, threatening to take on c3 with check, of course, and followed up with queen a4 on the next move, which prevents the white pawn from advancing to a4, which white wants to do in lots of lines, so he can play bishop a3. And this is going to be a strong post if the bishop manages to get there, so it's good to prevent that move, and it also attacks the a3 pawn, which is the target for black in the winnower. Another of the ideas of this move is to provoke the move that my opponent played, bishop d2, which brings this powerful dark squared bishop to a suboptimal square. Of course, it's tempting to play this with the discovered attack c4 pending, although that's not actually a good move, but you know, if you don't not too familiar with the opening and the ideas, it's something you could easily play. Better is queen d2, and a4 and bishop e3 can come next, unless black plays queen a4 now. And you know, this a4 and bishop a3 is probably the only sensible plan for the dark squared bishop now that this f4 push has been played. And at this moment in the game, after bishop d2, I made a committal decision that is against the true spirit of the winnower. c4. Really, black should aim to install a piece on this square, because it's an outpost square now, because this pawn has gone to d4 and white doesn't have a b pawn. And also this c2 pawn is a target for black, and playing this move c4 makes it much more difficult to attack. C takes d4 and it would be on an open file. So you know, this move looks tempting because it locks the position and everything becomes a lot more clear cut and easier to understand, and Botvinnik often played this way as well, but I'm not completely convinced that it's the best approach. It has the plus side of hemming in white's light squared bishop, which is good, but it's going to be hard and laboursome for black to create any initiative on the queen side now, which he should be doing in the French. And it's a line that I use a lot in Blitz with a concrete idea that we'll get to later on. But overall, this game has made it clear to me that it's definitely not the best approach for long games. So anyway, both sides now develop their knights, knight f3, knight bd6, c6, sorry, all normal and expected. Another benefit, incidentally, of queen a5 provoking bishop d2 is that if the white queen ever is lured away from the defense of this dark squared bishop, and this knight here on f3 moves, black will be able to play knight takes d4, which is a recurring theme that I've been able to play several times. Turns his pin around on white. So now both sides develop their bishops to the only reasonable squares, e2 and d7, and castled. And here's the concrete idea that I was talking about. Black castles long, with the point that I will be able to use my pawns here on the king side to pawn storm his king, and you know, this is made somewhat more difficult by the fact that my opponent has played f4, but even so he has no matching pawn storm on the queen side because these pawns are locked. Okay, he can move his a pawn, but it's nowhere near as threatening as 2 or even 3 pawns bearing down on the white king, depending on what happens here. On the other hand, white has the b file, which is a very significant factor. I'm used to playing king b8 and bishop c8 in order to neutralize this in blitz, but throughout this game I realized that white just has far too much play here, as you'll see. On the plus side, it's very hard for him to get activity for his minor pieces. So my opponent continued immediately with queen b1, moving the queen away from the defense of the bishop, all fine as long as this knight doesn't move. And you know, as for me, I wanted to get my kingside play underway. I want a pawn storm, of course, and I want also to secure the f5 square for my knight, which can be a strong and stable posting as long as measures are taken to ensure that that's the case. And it's also a preventative measure against him pushing f5, if indeed he wants to. So in order to enable that, I played h5 now to stop any g4s, but you know, it's unlikely that white will play that, but I want a pawn storm anyway, and this just secures f5 for my knight. So he followed up with queen b2, and he is of course preparing to bring a rook to b1. So now it was time for some defensive moves. King b8, and after rook b1, bishop c8, undeveloping the bad French bishop to its starting square for an inactive defensive role. It also guards e6 from here, which black has to keep an eye on after he pushes his f-pawn, which generally you should do in the French, and especially in this case because I want to try and create something on the king side. So black is not getting mated anytime soon with this bishop on c8, and it's not easy for white to bring more pieces into the attack, but there is tactical pressure, as will become apparent later. My opponent does have his a pawn to push as well, and he went for that now with a4. Okay, that's the end of part 1.